As was said, I'm Luke. I've done a bunch of stuff. I used to have the number that says how many incident response engagements I've worked, but I work internally for CSERT now, and my employer's like, hey, stop publishing that. That's not what we're proud of. So I've done a bunch of incident response engagements. Most of these engagements are interactive breaches. So an attacker has gained interactive access into an environment, and now starting to get up to some shenanigans. Just out of curiosity, how many people in the room have worked that kind of incident response, breach response? Good job, New Zealand. Okay. Quick disclaimer here. Basically, I've worked with a bunch of you in the past, and you may go, hey, that looks exactly like what we worked on. It's not. You're wrong. Please don't sue me. This is the Secrets Group. The Secrets Group is a company that basically does escrow. So they receive sensitive information like source code or patents or contracts or chemical formulas and stuff. And they store it on behalf of their customers until payments are made or agreements are made or whatever it happens to be. Because they store all of this sensitive information, they are very, very juicy targets for hackers. Unfortunately, they have recently been the victims of a security breach, so we're going to run through what the attacker did, what the Secrets Group could have done to prepare, and how they responded to this incident. Pretty standard stuff. If you talk to any red teamer, and every time I talk to a red teamer, they say if phishing is on the table, they're going to get interactive access into your environment. And that's what happens here. The attacker sends a phishing email, it's got a malicious .docm attached to it, so it's a macro-enabled Word document. It allows the attacker to get into the environment. Now, it's Luke the receptionist, it's always Luke the receptionist that opens this email, gives the attacker access into the environment just as a standard user. How do we protect against this? We disable macros. I know we're cutting edge here today. And I poke a bit of fun here. It's not necessarily always this easy. Sometimes you're going to be using macros in your environment, so do some testing before you do this. But it's worth pointing out here too that Microsoft is trying to do this for you. Earlier this year, they did push a change that disabled macros, so you didn't get a pop-up at all. It was just, hey, macros aren't going to work anymore. And then they rolled it back. So the downside to this, though, is that now attackers know that Microsoft is trying to push this change. They're going to lose. They're going to lose this relatively easy attack vector soon, which means they're pushing into it until that gets disabled by Microsoft. So beat them to the punch. Disable it in your environment if you don't need it today. The other thing that we want to look at here is user awareness training. Your users are the most comprehensive IDS that you have in your environment. Now, your users might be your sysadmins from a security point of view, or they might be your standard users. But they're always interacting with these systems, and they're probably going to be the first people to know if something is acting odd. Try and turn your relationship with your users into a rewards-based or a happier type relationship instead of slapping them over the hand all the time. Reward them sending phishing emails into you. These posters here have been published by CertNZ. Throw them on the wall so that security is a bit more top of mind, a bit friendlier, a bit cool looking, so that users want to reach out and report these phishing emails when it comes in, so you can catch the attacker a lot sooner. But the security group didn't do that. So the attacker has gained access into the business users' subnet. They're on Luke's machine. They're going to do some privilege escalation. They want to get access to a local administrator or system on the machine that they've landed on so they can run some additional fancy tools, and then they're going to want to move through the network to gain access to additional credentials, eventually make their way to the secrets. How they do this is they take advantage of group policy. So the Secrets Group did some things right. They were setting a unique administrator password per workstation. And the way they did that was they deployed a script via group policy that took a hash of the workstation name, an MD5 sum, and used that as the password. Unfortunately, when you push scripts like this via group policy, they wind up on every machine that implements it or the group policy gets pushed to, so the attacker can read that, and they immediately know how to gain access to local administrator on every machine on the network. Not great. Once they have that, the attacker uses RDP, RPC, and WMI to move laterally through the network. So we're going to start with hardening our workstations. The problem is it's hard to set local administrator passwords. The solution, thanks Microsoft, is the local administrator password solution. That one should be pretty easy to remember. Look into it. It's still set by a group policy and things like that, but it sets it automatically. A couple of other recommendations here are to disable remote logon for your local administrator. What you're ideally looking for here is to set your local administrator password just to be the one that can be used when you're physically sitting in front of the machine. If your service desk or your system engineers or whoever it happens to be are using local admin over the network, they should probably be using network credentials to perform those kind of actions. Finally, enable host-based firewalls. I know that we all love sharing the last season of Game of Thrones. Probably shouldn't be doing that on a work network anyway. And if you're going to do it, use a USB. Come on. Enabling host-based firewall has a bunch of benefits here. We can stop the attacker moving laterally with a bunch of applications that shouldn't be used over the network. And you can still set up your firewalls to allow your tech support or your service desk access into these workstations. Just don't allow the workstation to workstation communications. We also want to look at logging. But before we look at logging, we need to think about, well, okay, if I'm going to turn on logs, how far back do I need to turn them on for? Because enabling logging can be very, very expensive, depending on how long you're going to be retaining them for. This is a table that came out of Mandiant's 2022 M-Trends report, and it talks about dwell time. And dwell time is effectively how long an attacker is in your environment before you detect them. So if an attacker comes in on Monday and you get a detection that gets triggered on Friday, it could be the user reporting the email finally, or your IDS going off, whatever it happens to be, your attacker has been in your environment, and the attacker has been in your environment for 5 days, or you've got 5 days of dwell time. We can see here that dwell time has been improving over the years, but if you say, look, our internal detective technologies aren't too flash, when we get alerted about an intrusion, it's probably going to be an external notification. You're looking at an average of 28 days. If you say on top of that, for me to perform incident response and do digital forensics and everything else, it's going to take me 14 days, you're then looking at 42 days of log retention to ensure that you can have full coverage of logs for the event that you're looking at, and you've got hard numbers to back that up instead of just management, we should have it for a month because. That's how we work out our logging retention periods. Logs also don't need to seem to be useful, and this one's a little bit controversial. A lot of the workstations that I look at when I do incident response engagements, your standard desktop has more than 100 gigs free disk space that you can consume without impacting the end user at all. That's a lot of distributed log storage. By default, Windows stores 20 megs per event log file on disk. So you could blow that out to 1 or 2 gigs for your key event logs. Users are never going to notice. The argument, of course, is that attackers can delete logs. And that's true, they can, and you may lose that. But when the attacker does delete those logs, you then have a brand new IOC or indicator of compromise, or you know how this attacker works a little bit better. When you delete your Windows event logs, it typically generates an event as well. So I can then go, this particular attacker that's compromised us right now deletes event logs. I'll then ask all of the other systems that I have in my environment, hey, have your event logs been deleted? I'll find 5 or 6 other ones where they've been deleted, and I go, attackers probably touch these ones as well. I need to go and look over there. Ask a system administrator, and they'll say, we've done it. We've enhanced our retention. We have application, we have security, and we have system. What more could you possibly want from us? Out of the box in Windows 10, maybe 1 or 2 more. Now, not all of these are going to be viable. They're not all going to be useful during incident response investigations. For example, if you don't enable Hyper-V on your desktops, probably not worth enabling Hyper-V logging either. So run through these. There's a bunch of guides online that say, hey, these are valuable for incident response. Remember that they're here, and do your own internal evaluations as well to work out which ones add value for you. For example, our attacker in this case is using PowerShell for persistence. Is using services for persistence, and here's an example of an event log for the service being installed. We see the service name as a random uppercase, lowercase 16-character string, and in my experience, that means you are looking at Metasploit, or one of the Metasploit derivatives like Cobalt Strike. I've thought that every time, and I'm yet to be wrong, which is pretty cool. I immediately know kind of what tools the attacker is using as well, and it helps to inform my incident response. All this is basically doing is taking a base64 blob, loading it into memory, and using that for command and control. But this was done by Luke P. He's a dodgy guy there, Luke P. So we go and we try and work out, okay, well, when did Luke P log into the system? Because he has to authenticate to the system before he can install that service. Here we have a log on event. We can see our log on type is 3. And this tells me this was some form of batch script that executed. If it was log on type 2, someone's probably physically sitting in front of the machine authenticating or using a similar service like BNC. And if it's a type 10, you're probably looking more something like RDP. We can see where they came from. So if this was the first machine I was looking at, I immediately have another machine to go and look at to work out how the attacker got onto that one as well. And then we have who they logged on as. We already knew it was Luke P in this case, but we also have the logon ID here, which is just a random value, which is really, really cool. So these random values are only generated between restarts effectively. So if I log into this machine 3 days in a row, never restart the machine, this value here, the logon ID, will always be unique. If I log on Monday, restart the computer, log on Tuesday, there is a small chance that these will collide. So not always going to be unique between restarts, and you've got to be aware of that. They can collide, but it's unlikely. So I take my logon event, I search for that logon ID, and I work out when the attacker then logged off. Because this takes me from, I have to look at everything that ever happened on this machine, to I have a logon time, 9 AM, I have a log off time, 10 AM, and I have 1 hour of activity that I need to try and investigate what the attacker did. And it really lets your investigators focus on the important stuff. Okay, we know that our attacker in this case is using PowerShell. So we want to enable our PowerShell logging as well. A lot of attackers using PowerShell these days. This is script lock logging, again built into Windows. We can see that in this log, the attacker ran the invoke-kerberos.ps1, which is a fancy script that we'll go into a little bit later, and we can see all the arguments that they passed into it as well. As a forensic investigator though, I want to go, well, what's the contents of that script? And script block logging has us covered. It will actually take the contents of all of your scripts and log them out as well, because they're being executed in PowerShell. What's really cool here too is that if this was base64 encoded like we saw in the service, it'll base64 decode it and then it'll log it. So it logs it just before execution. So it'll help with a bunch of that deobfuscation stuff as well. The question then becomes though, okay, they ran the script, what kind of response did they get? And that's where we have transcription logging coming into play. Now, transcription logging doesn't log into the Windows event log, which is a real shame. They're plain text files that get written out to disk. You can configure where via group policy. Typically, it's going to be into your users' My Documents directory. We get a bunch of information here, including the process ID that it was, so we can use correlation. We have individual command start times for each command that was executed. We can see the command that was run, and then most importantly here, we have the response that was generated by the script as well. So invoke Kerberos here is going to list a whole bunch of service accounts, which are typically highly provisioned and occasionally have really poor passwords, and dump out their tickets that the attacker can then take offline and try and crack to work out the accounts to those work out the passwords to those accounts. So as an incident response specialist, I now know, okay, I have a bunch of services that I need to go and look at the logon events for to see if they've been used maliciously because I've been exposed to the attacker. Finally, I would be remiss if I didn't mention Sysmon. And this is the best slide that I can create to show the power of Sysmon without having an entire 1 hour talk on it. Sysmon is fantastic. Now, it doesn't exist within Windows by default, so you have to download it as part of the sysinternal suite. And it's published by Microsoft. You take the binary, you take a config script, you push it via group policy or SCCM, or however you wanted to push it. But the key here is that every arrow that you see is an event ID that can get logged, or an event that can get generated when that occurs. We can see that Word was spawned by Outlook, PowerShell was spawned by Word, some files were written to disk, some WMI persistence took place, some C2 domains were called out to. Just from this one event log source, we can tell a lot about what the attacker did on this machine. Sysmon, when configured correctly, can make incident response really, really easy. But the secret script doesn't have that. So the attacker has moved through the business user's subnet and he's targeting the Active Directory server, or the domain controller. So what the attacker does, he gets across there, he runs memcats on a domain controller, which is significantly less than ideal. If you're wondering why that's less than ideal, memcats is effectively a credential stealing and dumping tool and reuse tool. And your domain controller is where you store all of your credentials. So you combine those two things together and you're having a really, really bad day. I was talking to a manager during one of these incidents once, and the manager says, okay, the attacker ran mimic hits. Yes, sir, he did. He says, it's not built into Windows, is it? No, it's not. He said, well, okay, what if we just stopped the attacker from running attack tools? And I said, my God, you've done it. You've solved security. Now, application whitelisting was touted as the solution to security for a while. Unfortunately, there are tools like Task Manager that are built into Windows where you can still dump the contents of processes. In this case, LSAS is where your credentials are stored in memory while they're being used. Dump it out to a file, the attacker steals that file off the desktop, takes it back to his attacking machine where application whitelisting isn't installed, and then runs Mimikatz or John or whatever across that. So it's not the silver bullet that we thought it was going to be, and there's a bunch of arguments for why you shouldn't implement it or why it's too hard to implement. And these arguments go backwards and forwards. For the sake of time here, all we're trying to really achieve with all of the controls that we talk about today is slowing the attacker down and trying to make them move outside the wheelhouse so that they make mistakes. If the attacker is used to running Mimikatz on every engagement and it always works, and then you take that tool away, they either have to go back offline and do some testing, trying to work out a solution that's going to fit better for your environment, or they're going to do testing in your environment and things will fail and they'll make more noise and they'll leave more artifacts behind. Application whitelisting, just install it on your service, or just install it on your DCs, and you can get around a whole bunch of these arguments while still adding a lot of value to your organization. But the attacker stole the credentials, so we want to make them hard to use. And as we heard in the keynote this morning, two-factor authentication can be absolutely fantastic for making these credentials frustrating. Again, you don't have to deploy it everywhere. Just deploy it on the services that are external facing, or just on your admin accounts, or in this case, just in the secret storage network, just to get to there. Just slow the attacker down, make it harder. Unfortunately, the secrets group didn't do that. The attacker has a bunch of extra credentials now. They know where the secret storage network is, but there's a firewall in the way. Unfortunately, there is a vulnerability within this firewall that the attacker finds. So the attacker inserts a custom firewall rule that says, from one of the internal systems, doesn't matter which one, allow me to RDP through to the secret storage network. And again, we're keeping with the cutting edge recommendations here. Let's look at patching. Now, I was wandering around Christchurch the other day, and I noticed that patching has fallen out of favour among certain demographics. Unfortunately, one of those demographics is our sysadmins. Patching, especially internally, doesn't happen as reliably as it should. There's a bunch of arguments for this, especially within management, I've noticed, where my job as a manager is to have 99% or 6/9 or whatever uptime on this internal firewall. So that's my focus. What we as security professionals can do, what I've used with some success in the past, is go, okay, well, here's the risks of not patching. Write them all down, and here's the risks of patching, and here's how I'm going to mitigate them. Send them as an email to that manager with the question, can you reply in an email saying that you are accepting these risks on behalf of the business? You may have mixed results, but it's worked really well for me in the past to get patching programs implemented. But the secrets group didn't do that. So the attacker has moved through to the secret storage network. The attacker has accessed all of the data. They've exfiltrated it out so that they can extort you as well, pay us or release it to the internet. They've also deployed ransomware so that nothing gets left behind. Basically, they're going to extort you twice because they're really clever like that. The only connection we saw was RDP. And here's how the attacker achieved that. Basically, when they made the RDP connection, they chose to pass through printers and the clipboard. This means when they RDP through to the secret storage network, they can right-click on a folder that's interesting to them on their desktop, their attacking desktop. They right-click paste. Whatever folder they're interested in gets pasted on their attacking machine. And that's how data exfiltration can happen via RDP. But maybe disable those settings if you don't need them. And to defeat ransomware, implement backups. We're keeping with the rock-solid recommendations here. But test your backups as well. What a lot of attackers really like to do is sit in an environment for a while, find out what your backup retention policy is, and then encrypt the backups as they go through. So if you say, I'm going to keep 3 months worth of backups, for 3 months, all they're going to encrypt or otherwise destroy is your backups. At 3 months and 1 day, they're going to encrypt everything else because you've got no backups now. If you test your backups and you go, hang on, these backups are encrypted, this isn't working right, then you can protect yourself against that kind of attack. You also want to make sure that your backups are stored offline, because if you leave them on an external hard drive that's plugged into the machine all the time, the attacker's just going to have a field day with it. Alright, so we know everything that the attacker did. We're going to have what's called a remediation weekend. Late Friday night, we're going to disconnect the entire company from the internet so that we can move at a slightly more relaxed pace and know that the attacker isn't coming behind us and planting more backdoors. We're going to rebuild all of our machines. We're going to reset all of the passwords. We're going to restore from backup where it's appropriate. And we're going to build detections into our environment. So we know which C2 service the attacker is using. We're going to build detections so that if any internal machine tries to reach out to that again, we get alerted to it. Hey, the attacker's back, he's doing the same shenanigans. We can start incident response faster next time. And we did it. Happy days. Come Monday morning, all of our users are signing in, and everything's working really, really well. And then on Wednesday, one of those internal machines is trying to reach out to the same C2 domain, but we don't know how the attacker got in. And then one of the system engineers who was away for the weekend, because there's always one of them, you know who they are, reaches into his drawer and he pulls out a piece of paper and he says, well, this is what my network diagram looks like. Can we see maybe a slight difference here? So what happened here was the attacker had maintained access to the environment via this backup link that people had forgotten about. And when the computers were rebuilt, compromised one or two of them, planted some backdoors, and then carried on his attack again. Basically just reinfected the entire network. And it happens more than once in engagements have worked, unfortunately. So the solution to that is to document your stuff. And document your stuff not in the engineer's top drawer, but in a site where everyone who needs access can get access to it. We're also going to document out our incident response playbooks. So things that you don't do very often, but that add a lot of value when you're doing incident response, need to be documented out as well for a couple of reasons. If I want to document out how to prevent access to a C2 so that nothing can access that C2 server when I identify it, as an incident responder, I can then give that task to the service desk or to someone who's not me, because this is really boring and I want to do the interesting stuff, and they can take care of it. When you document these though, actually test them and keep them up to date. I will guarantee that at least 30% of your version 1 playbooks will be wrong or missing a step or going to the wrong team. So make sure that they're documented out and tested, and you're incrementing the updates for these as well. Finally, we're going to document our investigation itself. So, which hosts were infected? What's a master timeline of everything the attacker did from start to finish? What indicators did we capture? They might be host-based, so services being installed, user accounts that were compromised, user accounts that were created, or network-based, what protocols the attacker using, what IP addresses or domains they're talking to, all that kind of stuff. And then all of the evidence as well. If you haven't done incident response before, CrowdStrike published this incident response tracker for free, and it's a really good starting guide if you're trying to jump into Blue Team or if you haven't done it for a while. It's just a spreadsheet. All of the tabs and stuff give you a really good hint for the information that you should start capturing and start planning to capture before incident response becomes a requirement in your organization. And that's me. Thank you all very much for your time and attention. The slides will be posted there on the 5th of December. If you do have any questions, I did have to cut some of the content of this talk, unfortunately, but I've got a bunch of stories that I can talk about when certain people aren't watching or recording, and that'll be taking place at the campfire today and tomorrow.